Welcome to Question Time. Tonight we are in Beckenham. On tonight's panel, Mims Davies, elected in 2015, a minister under Theresa May, now a government employment minister. Backbench Labour MP, formerly a shadow minister in Ed Miliband's team and known for her campaigns on a number of issues, including maternity leave for MPs, Stella Creasy. Stephen Flynn, elected as an MP in 2019, the SNP's Westminster spokesperson on business, energy and industrial strategy. Nazir Afzal, solicitor, former chief Crown prosecutor for the North West of England and former chief executive of the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners. And Canadian clinical psychologist and writer, author of the best-selling 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, Jordan Peterson. Good evening, welcome to the panel, welcome to our audience here in Beckenham, great to see you, and welcome to you at home, of course. Do join in the conversation on social media in the usual way at BBC Question Time, and we'll hear what you think about tonight's debate. So, our first question tonight is from Valerie Hero.
Is the decision to water down the eastern extension of the high-speed line a betrayal of the people in the north who voted for the Tory government? And how can this decision be explained in the context of levelling up?
Stella.
You've asked and answered your question, because absolutely it is a betrayal. 60 times the government told us they were going to provide not just High Speed 2, which is the connection between Birmingham, Leeds and London, but also the Northern Powerhouse line, which would have connected through Bradford. I'm pretty sure Nazir's going to have some strong words to say about that. And actually, as a London MP, I care passionately about these things, because for me it's not an either-or. TfL, our local ride, is also being held to ransom by this government. It's like they're trying to make it harder for people to get to work, just at the point when we need people to be able to get to work to come out of the pandemic. Investing in infrastructure like railways is absolutely critical, not just to levelling up, but to our entire economy. And I just can't get my head around it. We saw a budget where they were investing and encouraging people to take flights, but now we're making it harder for people to travel around the country, travel between the country, travel across country. It is a complete betrayal. Many people voted for this government, and I recognise why they did that, because they heard a government that said, we understand this country is uneven and that's not in anyone's interest. Well, now we know what they meant was the unevenness was between their mates rather than the communities and regions across our country, and we'll all pay the price accordingly.
Nazir.
Well, I have the good fortune of living in Manchester, although I lived in London, so I don't want you to hold that against me. And absolutely, what Stella said a moment ago, we've gone from the Prime Minister's car crash last week to this train crash today. The reality is that, you know, whenever I get on a train in the north of England, travelling between Manchester and Leeds, for example, I'm always humming Thomas the Tank Engine.
Gosh, that must be something for the other passengers.
Well, it says something about me, I think. We used to...
I dread to think who you think the fat controller is.
Well, until recently we had pacer trains, which were old buses upon which we attached railway wheels. And we had a ladder that you would use in your back garden as your escape route. That was until a few months ago. And the government have made promises around the Northern Rail for years, 60 times, I think Stella said, and she's right about that. We, in the north of England, invented railways, by the way. You know, it was worldwide. We invented them, north of England. Yet we now have crowded railway lines on with poor services, which don't necessarily get to where you want to get to. You take your life in your hands when you do. That can't be right. And I think the point you made quite eloquently about levelling up. You know, we were promised that we would be one country, and we would act like one country and behave like one country. But now you've got a sense where that practically people in the north were lied to. We were lied to. We were told that this actually is, you know, fraudulent, being able, because you win votes on the back of this. And you said that we were going to ensure that everybody would be equal. And the reality, of course, is that we're second-class citizens in the north of England. And we will be second-class citizens because the government wants to save a bit of money. And yet, I'll give you a good example. Wales is paying for HS2 and doesn't go anywhere near Wales. The reality is that we're paying for HS2 in the north of England, and we're getting none of the benefits. And it's not just about high speed, by the way, wrongly named. It's about capacity, freight. It's about getting all the, you know, everything that you think we need to ensure that businesses and communities flourish. And I'm really disappointed that we are where we are. You know, we have a train service in the 19th century when we should be having one for the 21st century.
Man here in the pink t-shirt.
Don't you think, for the amount of time that it's going to save on the travelling that it's a waste of money in the first place.
Well, you wouldn't want to be spending any of it?
No, what's it going to save? 10 minutes to Birmingham?
OK. Man here in the brown top.
For me, this is an issue of trust. The Conservatives had this in their 2019 manifesto, and they won votes off the back of this. So how can we now trust the Prime Minister who promises one thing but delivers something entirely different?
I mean, that's it, isn't it, Mims Davies? The Prime Minister repeatedly said this was a brilliant idea and promised it, and now it's not going ahead.
Why is he reneged on his promise? What's the rationale from the Conservative side? I mean, saving money is pretty vague, because if it's an investment, it's not necessarily a saving. So what's the rationale for doing this?
So we've got an integrated rail plan announced today where 8 out of 10 commuters will see a benefit. It's not going to be just city to city. Most people, and as the Employment Minister, need to be getting from towns into cities. It's not just about that city to city route. So what you're going to see is yes, that capacity, you're going to see the benefits to more people quicker and sooner. So the electrification will start before Christmas. For example, London to Nottingham will be 26 minutes quicker. And it's £96 billion of rail investment. This is levelling up. It is important. And when I talk to people... But
why did the Prime Minister... I mean, the question is about what was promised. Why did if it's such a great idea now, why did the Prime Minister promise something else as recently as February?
So nearly £100 billion.
No, but that's the question.
That's massive money.
Why did he promise something else and now do something different?
So that's massive money that everybody in this audience is paying for. And absolutely, it's got to have value for money. And we've got to look at it in the COVID context.
So it's because it's too expensive, that's the answer.
And where we haven't been able to proceed things, we're not just scrapping it, we're looking at other alternatives. So, for example, in Leeds, in DWP, we have our second HQ in Leeds. They'll be looking at a different type of transport network within the city itself. But as Employment Minister, one of the biggest frustrations that we have from our claimants is people who live in towns and villages near cities or near bigger towns wanting to get into work.
What, like
they don't necessarily want to go between Manchester to Leeds to work. They want to be able to go in from Leeds or in from the areas of Leeds into that area. So we are unlocking that with those 8 to 10 journeys, which will be better. Also, that electronic ticketing, I don't have it in my patch. I'd be really delighted with that.
All right. The man there in the blue shirt, yes. You, sir.
Thank you very much. The issue is not just the Elizabeth line, but then not the HS2, but we have also Elizabeth line, which is already nearly 2 years.
You're talking about Crossrail, I think.
Yeah, the Crossrail.
In London,
yes, that's right. Yeah, which is coming across. So I think the government is failing in many areas of transport, not just the HS2, but Elizabeth line as well, the Crossrail.
OK. Let's hear from the woman here with the hand up in the middle, yeah.
I grew up in France in the 1970s when the TGV was launched, so I'm afraid England is about 50 years behind times.
Right, well, that's put us in our place, absolutely. Yes, and you asked the question. What do you think about what you're hearing so far?
Well, I think quite simply the whole debacle can be explained in terms of just breaking a promise, I mean, quite simply. And I think it's quite interesting how the whole idea has been kind of reconceptualized. So it's not the kind of original plan, but it's now connecting other areas that weren't in the plan in the first place, which clearly is a good idea, but that is not, in my view, what people voted for. It's not what people understood. And I think from my point of view, if I lived in the north, if I was, kind of riding on the great powerhouse, I would be bitterly, bitterly disappointed that it's losing so much traction so quickly.
Stephen?
Yeah, I look at this in a slightly different way, because if HS2 is not going to Leeds, the reality is there's no chance it's coming to Scotland. And I have to say, I would be surprised if anyone was actually surprised at this announcement, because what we've seen over the course of the last 6 months or so from the Prime Minister is a litany of broken promises, be that in relation to, of course, the pensions triple lock, the international development aid commitments, the promise not to raise taxes. If we look a little bit further to my part of the world, the promise to deliver carbon capture and underground storage, or if we look at his past and his clear record in relation to broken promises.
Well, if we're looking at your patch and broken promises, I mean, the SNP in 2015 promised Arran and the Western Isles 2 new ferries by 2018. They're 3 years late, they're £100 million over budget, and they're still not here.
Although the Western Isles is certainly not quite my patch.
Well, no, when you're talking about what's happening up in Scotland.
But you can comment on everyone else's and everything else that's going on.
It is on the other side of the country.
No, but I'm just saying in terms of a broken promise.
There has clearly been difficulties in terms of delivery of that project. But if we're
and there's no forgiveness for other difficulties.
Mims, I'll let you speak. If we're looking at the reality of Boris Johnson's premiership today, if we look at his history, it is broken promise after broken promise. And we see the reality of that in the polls at the moment, with his Conservative Party dropping. And we see the reality of that in Scotland, where the Tories haven't, of course, won an election since 1955.
Jordan, I don't expect you to be, given that you hail from Canada, to be up on the ins and outs of Northern Powerhouse Rail versus HS2. But part of this question is Veronica, tell me if I'm paraphrasing you wrongly, is about broken promises. That's why, Valerie, forgive me, it's about broken promises, and the Prime Minister in particular.
Well, it's a tough topic because it's very difficult for a politician to know everything about everything. And so it's easy to promise and then look into the details and find out that your initial promise was based on faulty information. Now, it's also the case that politicians rely far too much, in my opinion, on evanescent opinion polls to decide what they're going to talk about. And I think that's essentially unforgivable. That's happening in Canada in a manner that's absolutely despicable in my way of thinking. But the problem with breaking promises, if they're actually broken, especially if they're manipulative to begin with, is that you undermine trust in public institutions. And there's really nothing worse that you can do as a politician than that, because trust makes everything work and distrust makes nothing work. So people are right to be sensitive about what they see as, well, potential deceit. Now, you have to cut politicians a bit of a break because they are dealing with unbelievably complicated issues. Infrastructure issues are unbelievably complicated, and they can easily be wrong and then find out later. That's probably what they should say, though, right? Is, I had this policy. It was kind of stupid because I didn't know everything I should. My apologies for that. We think we have a better plan now. To be straight with people like that. My experience with people is they're very forgiving if you forthrightly admit an error.
And that's what people have said today. This is the speediest way of levelling up in the north. 8 out of 10 journeys.
No, but hang on, Jordan,
so why do you have a messaging problem then? This is a genuine question. I'm not accusing you.
We have a messaging problem because it's difficult. We've had COVID, we've had financing and changing, moving parts. But the reality here...
But the Prime Minister promised this during COVID back in February.
And the reality, this is an integrated travel plan which works with the way that people live and work. And as I say, connecting city to city and just ignoring what people need day to day to get to work is really important to look at.
People like me and Stephen to be crossing you. We're opposition politicians. But in the Parliament today, Tory MP after Tory MP, especially those MPs in those northern seats, got up and they were absolutely furious. The member for Keighley, the member for Thirsk and Moulton, the Transport Select Chair, because they all felt they'd gone out there, they'd made the argument to their communities that that's what they were going to fight for, and they were left absolutely red-faced. So fine, we're opposition politicians. You expect us to challenge the government. But when your own backbenchers, and the thing is, Mims, you've come on today and you've tried to say, no, this is great. Be honest with people. Say you got the sums wrong. Say you found the money for a royal yacht, but you can't find the money to make Bradford the economic powerhouse that it could be. And,
Mims, and then I'm going to move on.
It's the worst of both worlds. It's what people accuse us all of doing, of trying to spin them. And when your own people are saying, actually, I am embarrassed, I am furious, it isn't just a messaging problem, Jordan. It's a problem that you've got.
I think the reality here is looking at what you can feasibly deliver, and we haven't ruled things out. We've just ruled in quicker what we can do. So the electrification of the Midlands main line will start before Christmas. That was due to happen in the 40s. That's a blooming long time away. If you're like me, a commuter who stands on the side of the train track and needs more sooner, this is what that integrated travel plan delivers. And ultimately, government also has to be pragmatic, and it has to work with disappointed backbench MPs. Sadly to say, that does happen, and we have to work with them and completely leave things that are deliverable in the future on the table, which is what we've said today.
OK, I'm going to move on. I just want to tell you before I do that next week we will be in Cardiff. The week after that, we're in Weston-super-Mare with the former dragon Theo Paphitis. And if you live in or around either Cardiff or Weston-super-Mare and you'd like to be in the audience, why wouldn't you? Do come along, come and join us, and you can apply in the usual way on the Question Time website and follow the instructions there. Right, let's take another question from Charles Cacaniera. Charles, where are you? Ah, there you are.
How will the Home Secretary control the current immigration crisis, given that she perceives the asylum process as a merry-go-round?
Right, and of course the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, was talking in response, in particular, she's complained about the asylum process before, but the Liverpool bomber, Ahmad al-Swialmin, applied for asylum several times. His latest asylum was made in January 2021, and it was still under review. Nazir, do you want to kick us off on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, can I pay tribute to the taxi driver in Liverpool? He saved enormous numbers of lives. And to the emergency services, and then obviously we'll have to learn a great deal about what happened in this particular case. Your question really is about whether or not we should blame asylum seekers or immigrants for what that man did. I've prosecuted terrorists. I've never blamed a whole community or a whole faith or a whole city for what one criminal or two criminals
I don't think that is the question, Nazir. I think the question is Charles, tell me if I'm wrong, but if your question is, how will the Home Secretary control the current immigration crisis?
I'm coming to that, absolutely. Well, we apparently took back control a couple of years ago. And as a result of that, what we've done is we've lost the ability to send people back to the European Union. That was something we had when we were part of the European Union. So that's
Do you want to explain how we've lost that?
There was an arrangement within the EU which said that if somebody arrives from another country, you can send them back to the EU. That was to try and level up the immigration that was happening, or asylum seekers that were happening throughout Europe. We've lost that ability to do that. Your bigger issue about the merry-go-round, because the Home Secretary actually said that lawyers are to blame. Now, I'm a lawyer, and I often blame lawyers, but this time I'm not going to blame them. What lawyers are doing is enforcing the rule of law. That's the most important thing in a democracy. And what they're saying is that if the government comply with the law in relation to a particular asylum seeker or whomever, that person can either be deported or given some kind of residence, whatever it may be. You cannot go around blaming lawyers for the fact that your laws are perhaps not up to date. You've been in power 11 years, Mims, so you can't keep saying that the laws are something wrong with the laws. And additionally, you can't say that lawyers are simply exploiting the system. All they're doing is providing services and supplies to the most vulnerable in our society. You need them, we all need them at some point in our lives. And it's important to recognise that. And in fact, when the Home Secretary criticised lawyers, as she did a few months ago on the same issue, there was suddenly an attack in North London on a law firm, which meant that people were being provoked to violence against lawyers for lawyers simply doing their job. As I said, I often criticise lawyers for what they're doing. In this particular situation, all they're doing is providing support, advice, guidance, and the government lose these appeals, which tells you there's something wrong with the way they apply the rules, not the fact that the lawyers are doing their job.
Jordan.
Yeah, well, it's a mistake in my estimation, speaking as a psychologist, to politicize such events too rapidly. I mean, this man targeted a woman's hospital. You have to have a lot of...
I mean, that's where he ended up. We don't actually know at the moment whether that was his target or whether it got diverted there, but that's certainly where the explosion happened.
And we should be mindful there is investigations ongoing, and we should be mindful there could be legal process, if I may.
Okay, well, so I understand that that's the provisional hypothesis, but people who commit acts like that, especially when they're targeting innocent people, particularly when they're targeting innocent people who are already suffering, have a psychological tilt towards a malevolence that's so deep it's almost incomprehensible. And to phrase that in political terms primarily, I think is a mistake, partly because it doesn't specify the problem clearly enough, and it also risks the sort of entanglements that Nazir mentioned, which is the premature blaming of a political state or a group of people, a group of asylum seekers for that matter, for the actions of someone who's, to call it deranged, is barely to scratch the surface. And so the psychological explanations are more discomforting, I would say, than the political ones.
And in terms of the process itself, I mean, Charles's question about is how will the Home Secretary control the current immigration crisis? That's how you're phrasing it, given that she perceives the process as a merry-go-round. You know, she talked about far too many people coming here.
And you know, that's maybe. But maybe it's an excuse for this man to act out his pathological fantasies, too. And I would certainly look there first as a psychologist.
OK, the woman there, yes.
Do you think the Home Office has enough resource to manage this?
Mims?
Well, first off, I would like to, obviously, we need to be very careful. There's ongoing investigations. We don't know the motivations, and we need to allow the police and all of the people linking into this to be able to do their work and make sure that any justice is able to be served. I think we need to split
I mean, no
out.
one's been charged at the moment, so we're not under the laws of sub judice.
I know, but there is a lot of speculation, and we just have to, temper that until we know more. I think we need to be very careful about separating people who need genuine asylum, who need to be looked after and supported. I'm very proudly part of the DWP team working with Victoria Atkins, the minister responsible for the settlement of people from Afghanistan. We're weekly working on that, and that's a very proud record that we have.
And do you agree with the Home Secretary that it's a merry-go-round?
Well, the economic migrant issue of people coming across the Channel and actively trying to come into Britain illegally is very different. And the other point is that is actually gangmasters and people exploiting the most vulnerable people from around the globe who seem to think it's okay to then send them in small, perilous dinghies across for us to look after. And then it does throw in the question of resources and the fact that you can claim asylum in your first safe country, and that we absolutely need to be working around the globe where people are in peril and in need to keep them safe and support them that way. And the Secretary...
Is it worth bringing up COP26 in that context?
Climate refugee.
Because it seems to me that the best long-term solution to such problems is to try to make developed countries as rich as possible. And the best way to do that is not to control their pollution output in terms of, let's call it constraints, but to help them develop the cheapest energy as they can possibly manage as fast as they possibly can. I saw very little of that sort of idea coming out of COP26. So for long-term control of population movement, the only thing to do is to raise the living standards of people in the developed countries.
That's the balance you have to strike. We've got a responsibility as COP president, as bringing everyone to this really important agreement to see it delivered. But it cannot be at the expense of developing countries.
It absolutely 100% will be. And I don't think we have any moral right in the West at all to do that. I can't see it.
Language really matters in this debate. Now, we've heard Mims talk about economic migrants trying to cross the Channel. The overwhelming majority of individuals who are going on these dinghies are going on these dinghies because they are fleeing something. They are fleeing conflict, they are fleeing drought, they are fleeing circumstances that none of us will ever experience. And the Home Office own figures show that that is what they are doing. So this argument that they're economic migrants is absurd. And the reason that they go on those dinghies is because of the government's policies, the hostile environment that they have created, the fact that they got rid of safe routes, the fact that they have turned a blind eye
to what would the SNP do, Stephen?
It's this government...
Well, I'll tell you what they won't do is they won't give safe haven. Only one Scottish authority looks after the migrants through the voluntary dispersal team. Talking a good game, but not in reality.
I'll tell you exactly why only one Scottish local authority does that, because I happen to be a member of a Scottish local authority until a couple of years ago, and that is because the Home Office do not provide Scottish local authorities with the resources to do it, and they do not want to take part in this UK government's hostile approach to people who are seeking asylum in this country. Language matters. It's about time the UK government realised that.
Okay. Stella, I'll come to you. Sorry, were you in the glasses?
France is a safe country.
France is a safe country, you're saying?
If they're seeking asylum, why don't they seek it in France? Because it's a safe country.
And this again...
I mean, they're not required to by law.
Well, exactly. This is a common misconception that someone has to apply for asylum in the country that they go to. So, sir, I would simply say, if someone is fleeing Yemen and they go to one country and their family go to another, do they have to both claim asylum in different countries? Can those families not be reunited? That is the sort of policy that we should have, and the UK government's walked away from it.
The man here.
Just to follow that point up, that there's no drought or famine in France.
I think my point is being missed somewhat here.
OK, let's hear the man in the white T-shirt here.
Thank you. I think Stephen was absolutely spot on. Language, it's such a powerful tool, and I think Priti Patel is almost treading dangerous waters with it in terms of how she's dividing different groups. I mean, if you're almost categorising, you know, the asylum seekers as all as like committing terrorist activity, it just creates that divide between communities. I think with what Jordan was saying in terms of looking at the actual reasons, the psychological reasons for why they're doing these sorts of acts, I think that's the critical issue to do to look at first.
All right. Charles, you asked the question. You've had your hand up for quite some time.
Right. What I wanted to know is that, okay, people come in Calais in France to come over here, and if France gives them the opportunity to come over here, then that would mean that France is not really a place where they want to be. So why would they want to come over to the UK and not live in France? And secondly, people coming over in Belarus, which will eventually affect Europe, would want to come to the United Kingdom. So would that one be considered as not a safe place for them?
All right. Let me hear just from the man in front of you. Yes.
I just want to touch on the point about the refugee crisis and the refugees rather than the asylum seekers, because most people seek to come to this country or to other countries in Europe out of desperation, mostly from the Middle East. And I have to say that I think we have a moral ethical responsibility towards these poor people, and very often these people are in the situation that they're in because of our misguided and ill thought out policy in the Middle East. Yep. We invaded Iraq without much thought as to what would happen afterwards. Our policy in Syria was wrong, and we have a situation where people are fleeing their countries where 10 or 15 years ago they were quite happy in their own countries. So I think we have a responsibility towards these people.
Stella.
I think very sadly the discussion we've had about immigration and asylum in this country for so long has been about heat, not light. Let me offer three very simple things. First and foremost, it is not illegal to claim asylum. Yep. And when you use language like genuine, when the Home Secretary starts conflating terrorism and asylum seeking, it is a very slippery path. It's not just socially divisive, it's very, very dangerous, because we undermine something I think we've all been proud of. Over the summer, when people saw what was happening in Afghanistan, we were horrified. And we as a country stood up and offered to help people. We offered to help families who were stuck with that horrific regime. So number one, asylum in itself, refugee seeking, is not an illegal thing to do. So don't talk about illegal when you don't know whether those people in those boats have a claim or not. Secondly, I don't want to take on Charles's point head on, the system is dysfunctional. Because I went and looked at the figures today thinking that this discussion might happen, right? There are 125,000 outstanding asylum claims in this country at the moment. A third of those people have not had any ruling at all from this government. Only 5%, just a small fraction of them, involve an appeal, involve the cases involving the lawyers. Frankly, the problem isn't the lawyers, it is the politicians. It's the fact that we haven't invested in having this system right. And
why is that, do you think? Why isn't the money devoted towards solving that problem?
Well, thirdly, because we've always tried to see if we can find somebody else to blame for this. If you've ever been to the refugee camps in Calais, you'll know why people do not want to stay there, the behaviour of the French police. But you'll also know that is our border. That is a deal we did. We have to separate out immigration. Anybody who's seen the empty supermarket phrases, seeing the call for people to go and pick vegetables, seeing the shortage of nurses, knows that we need a new immigration policy in this country, whip smart. But that is separate from those people who are fleeing persecution, whether it is the Taliban, whether it is the Omaro people in Tigray, the people in Africa, the people who need our help. The point when in the 1950s we signed that charter and said, if you are under persecution, you will find safe haven with us. Everyone on this panel opposes the people who are running the boats, the horrific gangmasters. But the things this government is doing is opening up a market for them. And you're right, Jordan, I'm an MP
But I don't understand if the argument you're making is that clear and that straightforward.
Yeah.
And this is actually costly not to do. What are the structural impediments to introducing such a policy?
I think it's an incredibly
not like
good
many
question
governments
because I'm
handle
very
that well.
mindful. I'm very mindful, for example, that we lock up women who are victims of rape and persecution in war in a place called Yarlswood in this country, when actually it would be cheaper and more cost-effective to have community resolution for them, because the vast majority of them, quite rightly, when their legal rights are looked into, are released.
Okay, well,
we are spending money on a system that doesn't work, dividing our country, dividing our communities, and trying to find people to blame rather than solutions. Heat, not
Mims,
light. It has to change.
Do you want to answer Jordan's question then?
I think we are doing our best with what we have in terms of resources. I think we genuinely
What do you think
are,
when you
because
look at,
Mims,
when you say that, hang on, stop, just for a second. When you say that, there's a ripple of laughter through the room. What do you think of that response?
Well, obviously people are frustrated, and I get people writing to me in my constituency postbag every day who want to understand, exactly as Stella has said, what is the genuine needs that people have, and where is this economic migration, and where is it pure exploitation?
And what Jordan's asking, what's the impediment to sorting it out? To getting a system where...
I understand it's not simple. I'm not
well,
trying to
exactly.
claim that.
First off, it's not simple. First off, there are reasons that people only feel that they want to come to the UK, which is, as you described earlier, that we need to make sure, and the gentleman over there said, that we need to make sure that their homelands and their lives feel safe and feel prosperous.
International development aid then, is it?
Well, I would...
Because the consequences of that will be that people will seek to go elsewhere.
I wouldn't mind being questioned if you were doing your bit in Scotland.
Is that why you've not delivered upon, well, your part of the promise for £100 billion towards developing countries so that they can combat climate change? Because the consequence will be that those individuals will have to flee drought and they will come to Europe and they will come to the UK. Is that why your government has done none of those things?
So your government is not looking after and doing its fair share of people coming to these shores. And at the moment we are looking...
Give me some detail.
And at the moment we're even looking to try and do the fair share around the Afghanistan resettlement, which is going brilliantly well. I'm very proud of DWP on the ground in the bridging hotels.
More than our fair share. We took 10% of the UK's Syrian refugees. I think
and
that's more than Scotland.
We're learning from the Syrian resettlement scheme has worked brilliantly. And in fact, as Stella was saying earlier, we've got employers coming forward who are really keen to work with migrants, who are really keen to help people to, settle and give them that better life. But what we do need to do is stop those gangmasters who are taking £15,000 life savings off people, who are taking perilous trips day in, day out across to these shores.
You've made that point.
But it's so important.
And you
I know. It's just
making it okay if somebody drowns in a boat and we don't blame people and hold them accountable. So don't tell me that this government cares about these people, because most of the people on those boats are from Afghanistan. So if you are trying to pass a law that means that we don't hold people to account for whether they've tried to save somebody, rather than looking at safe passage legislation, we're one of the few nations that doesn't allow families to reunite. I've got constituents who've got family members in other countries who could look after them, but we won't let them come here to be able to do that. It's more cost effective and it's more humane. It is a dysfunctional system, but at the heart of it is a disrespect for other human beings, and all of us are stained by it as a country.
I don't think that's true.
I'm going to move on, because otherwise we won't get round to our other topics, and we had a lot of questions in tonight. Let's take another question from Isabel Blake-James.
Is it time to outlaw second jobs for MPs, or would we risk a brain drain from the House of Commons as a result?
Stephen?
I'm not sure we'd certainly risk a brain drain when I look across the benches sometimes. I do have to say it, people who don't seem to partake in conversation very much. But you struck upon an extremely important point, because what we've seen over the course of the last week has shamed us all. We've had Conservative MP after Conservative MP being embroiled in scandals of sleaze. We had the Scottish Conservative leader who forgot to register £28,000 that he'd earned. £28,000. How many people in this room would forget about £28,000? I mean, for goodness sake.
So was it shaming, Stephen, when the SNP Westminster leader, Ian Blackford, earned £300,000 since 2015? Was that shaming too?
So this is an important point, and I'll address that directly. So Ian Blackford, as I'm sure all of you will be aware, was an incredibly successful individual prior to entering Parliament. And Ian has phased out all of his external directorships. He showed leadership.
Well, he has now, but not before he earned £300,000, in fairness.
He had to phase them out. He was a successful individual prior to entering Parliament.
It took 5 years to phase them out.
And he has shown leadership in that regard. And that's leadership that's contrary to Boris Johnson. Because what Boris Johnson has done was when one of his MPs who lobbied on behalf of a private company, the Prime Minister didn't show leadership, he sought to cover it up. And what we've seen over the course of the last couple of weeks is a light has been shown on the Conservative Party. And the reality is that we should all be angry about that, because despite everything that's happened over the course of the last couple of weeks, they still believe that it's one rule for them and another rule for the rest of us.
Jordan.
Well, I would say, increasing sympathy for politicians on both sides of the ideological spectrum as I get to know more and more of them. And the fact that the public tends to assume that the political life is a gravy train and that most of the people involved are there for what is in it for themselves. And I don't think that that's true, certainly not in a functional state. And it's very difficult for people who are managing a political career to also simultaneously manage their own stable finances and economic development. A lot of people take a big hit in their career development to enter politics. It's a very unstable lifestyle. And then they're also in interaction with people. You talk about lobbyists, but lobbyists have their viewpoint too. Lobbyists are people.
As a politician, I'd interject and say it's not, by the way.
What's that?
Certainly not an impediment in any way, shape or form, just for clarity.
Well, it depends on who you are when you enter politics. The man you talked about, for example, has to put his finances on hold in order to get... Well, so you have a case right there where that's happening that you made.
But when we enter politics, we do so, firstly, knowing what the salary is, and it's an incredibly good salary, by the way, particularly for people from my sort of background. Mm-hmm. But more important than just the salary is the sacrifice that we all want to make to try and make people's lives better, to represent the public and improve their lives. That's the most important thing. Nothing to do with ourselves.
It's also genuine in the case of most people on both sides of the political spectrum.
But the last few weeks have shown in the UK that it's not been genuine. People have been feathering their own nest to try and suit their own means as opposed to looking after the public's interests.
Yeah, well, that does happen.
The woman there in the glasses.
Surely it's a choice as well that you get into that career.
Absolutely.
It's not you take that sacrifice knowing that that's what you're doing.
So do you think MPs should have second jobs or not?
No, I don't.
OK. Woman here in the pink top.
I just find it interesting how £20 a week can be taken away from the most poor people in society. And it's really difficult for those earning over £80,000 to think of losing some extra income.
So you're talking about universal credit. Yes, the woman there in the green sweater.
I mean, how can MPs do their jobs properly if they've got another job on the go?
Stella, I mean, the Labour leader had another job on the go, didn't he? I mean, he was earning over 100 grand from legal work.
You want the political knockabout on this, and I
think it's a fair point, isn't it?
I feel horrified by all of this because I think back. I feel like I'm old enough to remember when we had the cash for questions crisis in this country. When I first started thinking about getting involved in politics because I wanted to change. No, I'm going back to John Major.
Oh, John Major,
I'm going
of course,
back, that's
right.
how old I am.
OK, because we could go back to the Blair government as well on other issues, but OK.
And at that time, it would have been shocking to me to think that the Prime Minister was involved. I didn't think John Major was involved. I just didn't think he knew that was going on within his own party. We know when the fish rots from the head, we're all covered by the stench. You talk about trust in politics. Right now, only 15% of people trust politicians to tell the truth. The frustrating thing for me is, no, I don't think MPs should have second jobs. I don't know where people would find the time, for goodness sake. I mean, in the last month alone, I've just had a baby. I've got no maternity cover as an MP. I'm trying to work. I had 3,000 emails and requests from my local community, and I've been trying to deal with all of them. So where people find all these extra hours. But
and in fact, you brought your baby along tonight.
I know.
He's backstage.
I have to. I'm working. And if you want to talk about getting more people into politics, maybe open it up to mums. Crazy idea. But one of the things that really worries me about all of this is what Owen Paterson did, the original thing that's brought all this up. It's been illegal since the 1600s. It wasn't about whether you have a second job or not. It's about a conflict of interest. Yeah. Now, there might be some second jobs. You might say, OK, you want people who are legally qualified because of the Attorney General. You might want people who are doctors who are qualified. But what you don't want is the conflict of interest. So I don't care whether you are doing 1 hour or 100 hours. If you are in hock to a private equity firm in the city, and therefore that affects how you vote, or it could affect how you're voting on the laws that regulate our finance in this country, we've got a problem. That's why people don't trust us. And the problem is, do I think, if I was that young, excited teenager thinking about changing the world when all that first happened and I was horrified but but thought that still government could do good. Would I think that now, looking at this situation? That really troubles me. I don't think I would. And I think about all the voices and people who will just be put off because they think it's about money.
But just to be clear,
talking.
you started out saying you don't think MPs should have second jobs.
No.
It sounds to me like you're saying if they're a doctor or a nurse, then maybe yes, they should. Which is
well,
the Labour position.
Actually, the main thing, I think, is that we should get the government, we should get parties out of this, and we should get the Standards Committee, which is a cross-party organisation, has lay people on it, to get them to look at it and look at whether we might have exceptions. And the only reason I think about doctors and nurses is because you have to keep your professional qualifications accurate. So there's a technical thing there. I don't think there's a particular case for lawyers. Yeah, I want to be clear about that. But you know what? The government has made such a hash of this. The best thing they could do for our democracy is to get out of it and let a group of people who are experts in it and don't have that conflict of interest deal with it.
Woman here in the front.
I totally believe what you're saying about the conflict of interest and agree with you on that point. But I do think it matters whether they're spending 1 hour or 100 hours on a side project. Because if you're truly representing your constituents, if you're truly preparing for participation in a governmental process, then that should take the full focus of your time.
Believe me, it does. Believe me.
And the woman here.
Yeah, just to respond to one of the points, I think the run-up to election is long enough for MPs or future MPs to get their finances in order before they enter the House. And a 5-year contract at £82,000 a year plus expenses seems a pretty stable contract to me.
This is public service. This is not about the money.
I don't mind them having second jobs as long as it's stacking the empty shelves in supermarkets, HGV lorries, or picking fruit, because then they'll understand the consequences of their decisions. I also think that if you're involved in working in the public service, doctor, nurse, social worker, that kind of thing, I think there's some value in doing that because you, as ministers or parliamentarians, you're responsible for the public service. It gives you an insight. Again, it's about how many hours, but it gives you an insight as to what's happening in those.
But also, some ministers are responsible for business. Do you think they shouldn't work? Some ministers are responsible for business. Do you think they shouldn't work in businesses?
Right. Well, I draw the line there, and I draw the line simply because of this. I think having a second job that's in a private organisation, profit-driven, changes your first job. Simple as that. Never mind the conflicts of interest and the potential conflict of interest, etc. The reality is that you are the voters of Beckenham. Did you appoint or did you elect an MP for Barclays or an MP for Beckenham? You've got to ask yourself, in terms of your perception, is this person amplifying your voices or somebody else's voices, some corporate's voices? I think that's where the tension lies, and it's about perception rather than reality. Or as reality, it's important that you know that your MP is working for you.
I know a lot of people who... You know, I know a lot of people who have staggeringly successful careers, and they're often loath to go into a political field despite the tremendous expertise they've developed because they have to put everything that they've already accomplished on hold or in hawk, in a sense, to enter the public sphere. And I think one of the I understand the conflict of interest problem, but one of the problems with that is that the most highly competent people in many fields are dissuaded from a political career because it requires the unproductive sacrifice of everything they've built. And so what that does, in some sense, is deprive us of some of the best people who could be considering politics as a mode of public service. And so that's a complicated problem to try to solve.
Woman there in the green top. Hang on, wait a minute. Let's just get the mic to you. There you go.
Why do we assume that such people are the best people? They're obviously not the best people for the job.
Because they've demonstrated extreme competence in at least one area of
That's
inquiry.
banking. That's that person. This is why we're in the situation where we are with people like politicians that we have at the moment that are corrupt. There's no transparency. There's no accountability that you get in industry. And we don't even have it in our politics at the moment.
Yeah, but that's not
because
why
of
you
this
have corruption.
attitude
No.
That what is perceived as a good leader.
No,
And
that's not why you have that
issue
problem.
is.
Most people who are successful in their given field aren't corrupt. It's very difficult to become successful and be corrupt.
So
I know
we're making
people
that
like to think that, but it's just not true.
Corruption is good. It's acceptable.
Look, 3% of the population is psychopathic, and it never really goes above that. And the reason that it never goes above that is because being psychopathic is not a very good strategy. And so the idea that people in power are corrupt, by definition, especially if they've built up their stature and influence as a consequence of competence, is simply wrong. And so you do want people who've demonstrated high levels of competence in at least one other field to serve as potential political candidates. What else would you use as a criteria for their ability?
So why is
What
that
else do you have?
3% elevated as our leaders? Why is that 3% elevated as our leaders?
They're not. They aren't. That's wrong. And to think that way is counterproductively cynical. It's absolutely the case that institutions have a proclivity towards corruption under some circumstances. That's true of all institutions. But to blindly assume that that's more characteristic, let's say, of your political leaders than it is of you, for example, as a person, or that it's more specifically characteristic of political leaders than people who are operating at the highest level of their capacity in other areas. It's an empty sort of cynicism. It doesn't serve people well, and it's not true of reasonable governments or countries. Well, it's simply not true.
Just very briefly, if I may, just on that point in terms of corruption and political leaders, everyone will be familiar with the fact that if you happen to donate £3 million to the Conservative Party, if you happen to be a former treasurer, then you'll so happen to end up in the House of Lords, having been appointed by the, I think, Prime Minister. So there's a level of corruption that we probably need to look at in a little bit more detail, Jordan.
The man there in the blue sweater, you've had your hand up for ages. Yes.
Rather than banning the second jobs, do you think if all members of Parliament were allowed to have as many extra jobs as they want, they had to be unpaid, or the proceeds had to go to charity, things would change?
Well, that's a proposition, Mims. What about that?
Well, I think the gentleman's right. Many MPs have other roles. They are not other jobs. So patrons of charities, trustees, they are supporting and helping matters in their community. It's the paid advocacy, the fact that you could be affecting legislation because you're paid for another job is a completely different scenario.
Well, the question is about, is it time to outlaw second jobs for MPs, or would we risk a brain drain? And we had a member of the government talking yesterday morning, I think it was, saying, well, maybe they could do up to 20 hours a week, which is what, 2.5 days. So that's quite a...
Let me try and answer a few points. First off, as Stella says, as a constituency MP, my casework is quadruple what I would normally expect it to be, because people have been going through a difficult time and things are tough out there. And so, as Stella says, I'm a single mum. We're busy. You're a busy mum with 2 little ones. It's hard, and we.
So how do they find the time for all these jobs then?
Well, I think at different points in your career with different expertise or different interests. You know, if you're particularly interested in supporting issues around children, you'll spend more time on helping with children charities and things like that. So there might be times when you go further into something because it's something you've previously been involved in, and also your own local charity, your own constituents want you to be doing more, whether it's or can be or things like that. So can I just quickly come back to a couple of points? Number one, the Standards Committee, the vote has gone through. We'll be hearing further by the end of January. It'll be going through the House, and we'll all have to make a judgment on what's acceptable, etc. Primarily, we are all here for public service, exactly as described. You know, you give up those lucrative careers or less lucrative careers. I came into politics as a woman returner. I wasn't giving up anything lucrative. I was trying to go and do the next stage of giving back after being a local councillor. On the point in terms of the universal credit support, today we laid the regulations that some of our most vulnerable people will be £1,000 better off this year because of the taper rate changes, the work allowance, which will help to fill some of those gaps and those jobs that need to be done. And we have got over 1 million vacancies in this country. We want people earning and progressing in every sphere. And it shouldn't be about the jobs that MPs are doing. It should be about the opportunities we're all having.
Let's take another question from Julian. Julian Lee.
With the revelations from cricket's Azim Rafiq and footballers still taking the knee, what does this say about racism as a continuing undercurrent in present-day Britain?
Nazir.
The brown person will answer first.
Yeah.
No disrespect.
Nazir, so do you think that was wrong of me to come to you first?
I think so. I think.
Well, let's not do it then, Jordan. I don't mean that. I'm not being sarcastic at all. I mean, if that's how you feel, I respect that. Let's go to Jordan. Well, that's a fair point. I'll come to Jordan.
I think the same point I made earlier applies, is that things need to be particularized rather than generalized, as a general rule, let's say. And so this cricket player was facing racism by his own count. The question is, who, when, what, exactly, because otherwise it degenerates into something like a discussion of structural racism. And when it becomes abstracted up to that level, first of all, that pits group against group, which I think is entirely counterproductive. And it actually doesn't address the issue. You know, racism is a global and vague term.
Sorry, but why would you possibly do that? What did that mean?
Because I said it was a global and vague term.
The inverted commas as if it's not a real thing.
No, that isn't what it meant.
Well, what did it mean then? Explain.
It meant that it's indicative of low-resolution thinking. And what I mean by that is we use all these terms frequently in discussions like this that are
He was
containers
called
of undifferentiated content.
He was repeatedly called abusive terms directly linked to his ethnicity.
By who?
By not just one, but repeated members of the Yorkshire Cricket Club. He's had people contacted him. If it walks like a duck, Jordan, talks like a duck,
I'm not
it's a duck. It's racism.
I am not denying his experience.
Right.
What I asked was exactly who and when, and you just answered that question. So I would say those specific people should be held specifically to account for their actions before any movement up the abstraction hierarchy to a discussion of something like structural racism, which I don't think is helpful.
Well, he has talked about institutional racism in cricket. He says that's what he's experienced as a term, institutional racism.
Right, I know. And like I said, I believe that abstracting up the problem to that level of analysis does no good because it pits groups against groups. I think it exacerbates the problem. The concept of structural racism. It's too imprecise. It doesn't address the issue. Now, that does not mean racism does not exist. That is not what I'm saying in the least.
Maybe let's do less of the hand movements and let's look at the evidence.
So yes,
there was.
I'll try
the
to
evidence
control it in
was
the future.
About the experience that Azim had, about multiple attempts. I think when we talk about structural racism, one of the things that really occurs to me, if I think about it in lay men and women's terms, is the bystander effect. And what is so powerful about his testimony is not just the explicit racism that he faced, it's the numbers of people who stood by and basically normalised that behaviour. And all of us have a challenge to ask ourselves whether we are normalising forms of racism. And actually, I think that's what Nazir called you to account to about Fiona tonight, was to say we normalise the idea. If we're going to talk about racism, we go to the person of colour first and ask them to give us their hot take.
Can I just say, in my defence, I also tried to get everyone on the panel first as well, to make sure so that everyone has a go at the first question.
But when we talk about that what you did was racist. I don't believe that. I think what you did was a mark of respect. And now, that may have been inappropriate and it may have been taken wrong, but that doesn't mean it was racist. And so we are going to be precise about it.
You why the concept of structural racism. And we have a problem in British society. We have a problem particularly in sport. And we also have a problem when it comes to our definitions of racism, because people tend to lump people of different minority community backgrounds together. You know,
and how do you talk about structural racism?
I'm going to need to bring other people in as well.
But the thing for me that I think is so powerful is this concept of the bystander, is the idea of the person who may think of themselves not as a racist, who may not have joined in this poor young man being bullied in the way that he was.
I need to mention Stella simply because he has talked about it himself today, Azim Rafiq, that he has apologised for anti-Semitic tweets that he put out several years ago.
What I think is really powerful is how clear and compelling his apology is and how he's recognised it.
All right,
but bystanders are the challenge.
Let's hear from our audience. Yes, the lady there in the green.
So whilst we're continuing this debate, have we thought psychologically how young ethnic minority children feel right now that are trying to get into this sport in their country of birth?
Right. And do you want to take that?
Absolutely. Forgive me, Fiona, for
no,
doing what I did.
A very fair point, Nazir, absolutely.
Brown people, black people, people from minorities are tired of having to continue to describe how much racism we experience on a daily basis. And the example you've given about the children. I've watched children in Bradford and Birmingham playing cricket in the street with a bin behind them and a stick in their hands, and they have this ambition. At some point, they'll be able to play the professional game. And now we know from what we've learned this week, a fat chance. 30% of grassroots players in this country are South Asian. 4% end up being professional players. 25% of the England team had a father or a brother or an uncle who played for England. That's not a meritocracy. What is that?
Well, it might explain the results.
Well, they're pretty good, actually, so I won't go that far. But the point is, what that is a rigged system based on privilege. Now, this is where, Jordan may disagree with me or not. The reality is that black people, people from minorities are experiencing it, and it's not just cricket. You know, I've been doing some research recently, Fiona. It's tennis, it's rowing, it's cycling, it's swimming. Where are the British, black, Asian elite athletes?
Yes.
You know, all of these industries, all of these sports have a problem with racism, which is preventing young people of colour, from minority backgrounds, pursuing their passion, because barriers are put in their way. And the barriers that were described this week, Jordan, were around people being, just excluded, events around the pub when, of course, people may not want to go to the pub, events at weekend where you might have childcare issues, those kinds of things which are, in the old ways would have been called unconscious. I know you disagree with the word unconscious. The reality is that these are things that happen, but they happen for a reason.
No, I disagree with the use of non-standardized and non-reliable implicit association tests to act as a diagnostic agent for unconscious racism.
Yeah. So it's about the fact that we are saying to these young people that you haven't got a hope and that you cannot contribute. And the footballers you mentioned, I mean, I pay enormous tribute to our teams and the work they're doing right now, and the fact that they're recognising the impact of racism in our society with the knee every game. But remember when they missed a penalty in the Euro finals? Who got the abuse? Rashford, Sancho, Saka. What were their colour? The reality is that when we fail, we are not allowed to fail. Sadly, when people who are not like me or like some of the minorities in the community, they fail, they're given another job. Look at the number of managers that get relegated, white managers that get relegated and get another job. If you're a black manager and you fail once, that's the end of it. That is what I mean about systemic racism. It's as deep-seated in our society, and it goes beyond sport. We haven't got time to do that, but it goes beyond sport, because we're only 5 miles away from where Stephen Lawrence was murdered. 5 miles away. And that was institutional racism. And even today, you are 9 times more likely to be stopped if you're black. You're more likely to be arrested, more likely to be charged, more likely to be convicted on the same evidence as a white person if you are black. That is wrong.
I'm afraid you'll have to be reasonably brief.
I was the sports minister, so I'm really keen to come in on
we're
this.
running out. Forgive me, but we are running out.
I think the lady's absolutely right. If you can't see it, you can't be it. There is not enough people in the high echelons, particularly in sport, where young people can aspire to. And as the employment minister, I'm very mindful if you're a young black person, you're not going to get the employment opportunities, whether it's in cricket or anywhere else. And we've got to do something about that. And I'm very proud that when I was sports minister, we took this on and we started to unwind this and unpick this, because it is a reality that people live with. And it's not acceptable. And I agree with Stella. Let's call it out. Let's say what it is. And if we do fail as a team together, we all fail together. It's not about what colour you are, what your background is. So to give everyone a fair chance, it is time.
Stephen.
Yeah, just very briefly. If we don't accept that there is a structural problem, we will not fix that structural problem. So that's the first point that I want to make. I have very little interest in cricket, I'll admit. It's not a sport that's played very often in my part of the world. But I listened to the testimony in Parliament the other day, and I couldn't help but be moved by it, because it didn't matter if it was related to cricket at all. This was a young individual whose life had been turned upside down simply because of the colour of their skin. How wrong is that? And what we've seen in the summer in relation to Rashford and Sancho and Saka, so I was devastated. I wanted England to lose. I'm a big Scotland fan. But as soon as those boys missed those penalties, I was devastated because I knew what was coming. We have a problem. We need to fix it.
OK.
Can I ask?
No, I'm really sorry. Our time is up. There's lots you want to say, so forgive me, but we're out of time. I'm really sorry. I wish we could continue this longer. We could stay and talk afterwards. Thank you very much to the panel for coming this evening. To our audience here in Beckenham, thank you very much indeed. And, of course, to you at home, thank you so much for watching from Question Time in Beckenham. Bye-bye.